In the bitter cold of a Moscow night, the city seemed frozen under a thick blanket of snow, as if time itself had been suspended. The street lamps, solitary and inconspicuous, cast a golden light that danced across the empty streets, creating a landscape both beautiful and sinister. Each falling snowflake seemed to sculpt the silence, a peaceful and icy scene, but which hid within it the murmurs of a society in full turmoil. Moscow, despite its appearance of winter calm, beat to the rhythm of invisible forces, tensions barely contained under this layer of cold. The sounds of the city were muffled by the snow, but the political and social unrest that boiled within the walls of the capital was begging to be released, like a volcano ready to erupt. The Moscow's Hot Café, one of the few establishments still open at this late hour, seemed to be a refuge for lonely souls. It had a unique atmosphere, both familiar and foreign, almost like a theater where each patron became an actor in a play that would never end. Its red brick walls, worn by time, told stories of past generations, whispers of the past intertwined with those of the present. The glass windows allowed passers-by to take a look at the customers, curious eyes sometimes lingering on scenes of lives that crossed paths, but never really touched. The café seemed to be a sort of setting where lives overlapped without ever really meeting. Inside, people alone or in small groups murmured in a corner, creating a kind of soft, almost imperceptible hum, while the soft music floated in the air, tinged with melancholy, like an echo of the lost thoughts of the city's inhabitants. In a secluded corner, away from prying eyes, a man dressed in a black kimono sat at a wooden table, almost merging with the surrounding darkness. He seemed to have been there for an eternity, his gaze lost in reading an old newspaper, as if each word was a fragment of a puzzle that only he could understand. The world around him, frozen in the snow and the glow of the streetlights, seemed too indifferent to him. His face, marked by years and trials, exuded a strange tranquility, that of a man who had learned to face victories and defeats with the same serenity. His short, impeccably styled hair and his strong features seemed to echo a bygone era, but an era whose shadows would never cease to haunt this café. It was not a face that was easily forgotten. If he had looked away from the newspaper, he would have encountered intrigued, admiring, but also worried looks. There was something in him, in his way of being, in his silent presence, which commanded respect and fear. If we had taken the time to look deeper into his eyes, we would have seen not only infinite wisdom, but also incredible power, an ability to manipulate and control that was only revealed to those who knew how to look beyond appearances. The curtains of history had already closed around him, but he knew, just like the frozen scenery of the city, that everything he had built could rise again in an instant, like a breath, a cry in the night. His name, Vladimir Putin, was not simply that of a man. It was that of a symbol, an enigma inscribed in the marble of history, a name that was whispered in the shadows of discussions or that exploded with fury in public debates. But in that moment, in the dim light of Moscow's heart, he was just another man, seemingly calm and harmless, a lonely figure in a city that never really slept. He was not only the political leader of Russia. Before being a figure of power, before his name became synonymous with control and strategy on the international scene, Vladimir Putin had been a master in the art of karate. A man forged in discipline, in rigor, who had risen to the top of the martial arts, not by luck, but by years of uninterrupted effort and iron concentration. He was not just an athlete, but a true strategist, capable of observing his opponent with surgical precision and striking at the most opportune moment. In the circles close to him, those who had seen this side of his life, few dared to talk about it, because his martial past was not only a story of honor and glory. It was a sacred secret, a silent weapon which should only be brandished in moments when the situation demanded it. Karate was not just a sport for him, it was a philosophy, a way of living and perceiving the world. That evening, while Moscow seemed numbed by the cold, a different kind of confrontation was brewing. The Moscow's Hot Café, a place of peace for some, a refuge for others, was immersed in a cozy atmosphere, where murmuring voices and soft music intertwined in a kind of discreet symphony. But suddenly, the roar of the engines broke the harmony of the night. A dull, powerful, almost threatening noise vibrated in the icy air. Moments later, the café doors burst open, and a handful of bikers in black leather burst into the establishment, bringing with them the smell of gasoline and cold asphalt. There were 4 of them, imposing, each wearing a helmet that reflected the neon light with a menacing glow. Their leather jackets proudly bore the colors of the local gang, the Wolves of Moscow, a band of brutal men who ruled certain neighborhoods of the city without fear of the laws or the authorities. The leader of the group, Boris the Wolf, a colossus more than 2 meters tall, stomped forward, his boots echoing against the tiles of the cafe like a warning. His square jaw, shaggy black beard, and piercing gaze commanded fearful respect, and he observed the customers with a quiet arrogance, as if he were the master of the place. He stopped in front of the counter and, with a mischievous smile that revealed his white teeth, said to his men, "On the attack, guys. The owner of this cafe is a nice guy. But tonight, we're going to show him that we're here to have fun." The waiter, a nervous young man who had seen violent scenes in other establishments, froze when he saw the bikers approaching the tables. He felt fear knotting his stomach, and the anxious gazes of the customers turned towards the exit. Little by little, the cafe emptied, people preferring to disappear into the darkness rather than witness what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. All except one. A man, calm and relaxed, remained seated at his table. He didn't move, showed no fear. His eyes remained glued to the pages of the journal he held in front of him. It was a deliberate choice. In a situation like this, indifference was the best weapon, sometimes the only one. He knew they would come to him, but he had no intention of giving in to fear or intimidation. Indifference became his shield, his silent message. The bikers, however, were not the type to accept such indifference. Boris, annoyed by Vladimir's lack of reaction, abruptly approached his table. The sound of his boots echoed in the enclosed space, and each step seemed to sink deeper into the already tense atmosphere. He sat down, with deliberate violence, as if taking possession of the space around him. "And you, old man, haven't you noticed that it's time to leave? This is no place for guys like you," he chuckled, his voice harsh and mocking, completely ignoring the ordinary appearance of his interlocutor. He saw in Vladimir only a lonely old man, a stranger whom he was going to ridicule to pass the time. Vladimir didn't even look up. The newspaper remained motionless in his hands, his gaze fixed on the printed words, but in reality he was observing everything. He knew exactly who was in front of him. He didn't need to see Boris's face to understand the man he was. He had encountered people like him all his life, self-confident, brutal men, sure of their impunity. But that evening, Vladimir had no intention of submitting. Boris, seeing the indifference of his interlocutor, burst into flames. His face contorted with anger, and with a sudden gesture, he placed a firm hand on Vladimir's shoulder, as if to force him to stand up, to react.
"Hey, are you listening to me or not?"
"You're going to get up and get out, old man." But at that precise moment, Boris's hand found itself caught in a movement as rapid as it was unexpected, a burst of mastery that broke the balance of the gang with a simple gesture. Vladimir, with a fluid and determined arm, turned Boris's wrist with such precision that the pain quickly gave way to confusion. He applied quiet, but relentless pressure, forcing Boris to lean forward, bending his knee in silent submission. A muffled, almost inaudible cry escaped the lips of the Colossus, who was struggling to understand what had just happened. His surprise mixed with pain, and his mind tried to put together the threads of a situation he didn't understand. Vladimir's gaze, cold and unwavering, showed no pity, only quiet determination. This was not the first time he had faced such aggression, and every move he executed seemed to be a perfect reflection of his martial past. The other bikers, stunned for a moment by Vladimir's skill, rushed to intervene. But it was a dismal failure. With every move, every dodge, Vladimir seemed to be ahead of them, not physically, but mentally. His arms rose and fell with almost supernatural rapidity, gestures that seemed to anticipate those of his attackers even before they executed them. Each movement was not a simple reflex. It was a controlled dance, a choreography of controlled violence. The room, until then filled with palpable tension, became the scene of a brutal demonstration of precision. The first biker who attempted to strike was sent flying through the cafe with a force that even his imposing frame could not stop. He hit a table, knocking over everything in his path. His helmet rolled to the ground, hitting the tiles with a dull thud, while the man himself found himself on the ground, dazzled, confused, unable to get up. The second biker didn't do much better. When he attempted a side attack, Vladimir caught him in one smooth motion, his arms sliding around the attacker like a perfect grip. He spun the man around in a controlled whirlwind, before projecting him in a spray of cold light, like a toy that one throws away carelessly. The biker found himself disoriented, on his knees, losing his breath, while his own body seemed to betray him under the brutality of the movement. Vladimir stood up slowly, every movement calculated, every breath measured. His eyes slid to the last two bikers, who, caught in the frenzy of the attack, were now hesitating. Their leader was on the ground, and the violence they thought they were inflicting had not even left a scratch on their adversary. Vladimir looked at them without an ounce of emotion, his eyes staring at the last two members of the gang with icy coldness. "You should really think before you compete against someone," he whispered in a calm but impactful voice, as if he were speaking to children who had made a miscalculation. His words made their way through the room, seeming to echo in the silence that had fallen. The soft music in the background seemed almost unreal in that moment, off-kilter, as if reality had suddenly sped up, and everyone around them was frozen in another world. The last two bikers, a little more cautious now, stared at Vladimir with nervous glances, but their muscles were frozen, as if paralyzed by the intensity of the moment. Boris, still on the ground, struggled to get up. He growled, rage mingling with palpable fear. He looked up at Vladimir, but his muscles felt heavy, pain filling every movement. He struggled to his feet, staggering, his face marbled with rage and confusion. Vladimir's gaze, still unwavering, did not deviate. "You're going to pay a lot for that," Boris roared, but his voice trembled slightly, betraying his fear. Vladimir shrugged his shoulders as if this whole scene, this sudden violence, was just a trivial incident of no importance. He put his kimono back on with disconcerting ease, each gesture measured, as if he were performing a familiar and intimate ritual, contrasting with the brutal intensity of the confrontation that had just taken place. His fingers brushed the edges of the fabric, replacing the garment with a precision that spoke volumes of his experience, of years of maintaining absolute control, even in the most chaotic moments. His gaze did not turn away from the task, and yet, in the heavy air that hung in the café, everyone felt the difference. There was no jubilation in his posture, no trace of the excitement some would feel after a resounding victory. For Vladimir, this scene was just a detail in a much larger picture. "No, Boris," he said finally, in a calm voice, almost devoid of any emotion. "What will happen is that you will leave, and you will forget this meeting. You might remember it, but it won't change anything in your life. But you and your men will live with this humility, a humility you have never known." Vladimir's words, simple but unfathomably profound, seemed to hit the gang like an invisible slap, shattering the group's arrogance with a few syllables. Boris, whose clenched fists were still imbued with the rage of the moment, seemed to waver under this immaterial weight. The hardness of Vladimir's gaze was like a burden that no one, not even the giant that he was, could carry without giving in. It was not raw violence, but a much more subtle force, forged through years of discipline and calm. True power, Vladimir knew, lay in self-control, and the ability to face adversity without getting carried away. The bikers, horrified and distraught, began to gather together, their faces now marked with an involuntary, almost fearful form of respect. They helped their comrades to get up, each carefully avoiding meeting Vladimir's eyes. The silence that had fallen over the room was as heavy as a leaden blanket. No one spoke, as if simple words became useless in this context. Boris, his face disfigured by pain and shame, tried to stand up, but his trembling gait betrayed the loss of any certainty he may have had a few minutes earlier. He gave one last look filled with hatred, a look that was lost in the void, a hatred that, despite everything, did not manage to hide the fear that now inhabited him. Vladimir, implacably calm, did not even respond, his gaze fixed on the newspaper which he held in his hands like a shield. He didn't need to answer. The scene spoke for itself. The bikers, now subject to this humility that they did not understand but which they felt deeply, left the room in silence. None turned around, none sought to revive the illusion of domination that they had believed they held. They crept like shadows from the room, their exit as discreet as their noisy entrance. All that remained was the echo of their footsteps fading in the deserted street. The few customers who remained in the café, mute witnesses to this demonstration of power, stood up timidly. They exchanged awkward glances, as if they were trying to get to grips with the situation before risking opening it. And then, as one, they began to applaud. It was not a loud, triumphant cheer, but a tacit respect, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. It was a tribute to the man who had just protected them, but also to the man he was. They applauded without knowing if it would have any effect, but the gesture was there, instinctive, almost ritual. And yet, Vladimir didn't even seem to hear him. His gaze remained immersed in his journal, implacable, absorbed by the words that danced on the pages. The scene was over for him, and with it, victory. It was not a victory for him. It was obvious. He was just protecting his space. A space of tranquility that he had carefully built over the years. A space where nothing and no one could disturb the order he had established. The waiter, the nervous young man who had witnessed the scene from the beginning, approached slowly, his hands still trembling, his face pale. He felt like an intruder, a witness who should never have been there, but who could no longer ignore what he had just seen. He approached with palpable hesitation, his body tense with fear of saying something inappropriate. "Mr. President," he began timidly, his voice barely audible, as if simply speaking to Vladimir was a risk he wasn't sure he wanted to take. Vladimir turned his head slowly, his steel-black eyes settling on him. This look was not filled with anger, but with hardness, a hardness that was not hostile but simply uncompromising. He was a man of principles, and principles, for him, could not be negotiated. "Don't tell anyone about it."
Tonight, I am not Vladimir Putin. Tonight, I'm just a man passing through.
The waiter nodded, instinctively understanding that some truths were better hidden silently. Vladimir Putin's name was not the one he wanted to use that evening, not in this place, not in this situation. It was not the president he had seen this evening, but another man, a man both more human and more formidable, a man who had decided that this café, tonight, would be his territory, and that no one, neither gang nor authority, would come to disturb him. And in the calm that followed, like a calm sea after a storm, Vladimir resumed his diary.
Implacable. Master of the moment.
The pages turned beneath his fingers with quiet regularity, as if the world around him had ceased to exist. It was not a simple act of reading. It was an act of silent domination, a way of signaling that everything was returning to the natural order of things. The chaos had had its moment, but now it was a distant memory.